All right. Thanks for joining us on the Nature Bats Last channel. This is Guy McPherson again with psychologist Peter Miller. One of these days we're actually going to meet, and we're recording this conversation with one primary motivation. It's not that we really enjoy talking to each other, although we do. We could do that without involving all of you people. And so we don't have to record this thing. We're doing this primarily as a means of helping people with their many intellectual and emotional problems. And that's not to say that we don't have emotional or intellectual problems. We do. But we have reached a point in our lives where we understand something about various so-called problems. And so we're trying to help people deal with them. Today, I received an email message from somebody, which happens more than 200 times every day. So this is nothing exceptional that I received an email message from somebody. And by the way, if I don't answer your email message, it's because I threw it away because I didn't find it interesting. Anyway, this person writes, would you please discuss the many dissonances between the dominant culture's teachings/imperatives and ecological/moral ethics and the stresses those put upon individuals? Well, that's a mouthful. And I don't think any sentence should run more than about 7 words. So, that's into the 3 times as much. But that's where we're going to go. Peter, before we kick off our conversation about stresses that are put on individuals because of teaching/imperatives and ecological/moral ethics, can you tell us a little bit about your free course? And also, while we're here, tell us how it's going so far.
Well, to be honest, it's slowed down a little bit in the last few videos. And maybe, that's just par for the course when you're sharing mental health resources. Sometimes people seek them out more than others. So it's sort of plateaued a bit. I had a new registration just the other day, though, so that's kind of encouraging. We're sitting around 90 to 100 registrations, something like that. Um, and the course is actually continuing to evolve
I
as
have to
well.
interrupt. I have to interrupt right there. 90 to 100. I've taught courses with 90 to 100 people, and it's way more people than I can keep track of. So
Well,
I think that's impressive that you have 90 or 100 people signed up.
yeah, it's encouraging. I'm happy to see that people are interested in this subject because I think it really makes for a better experience, not only for people who are struggling with mental health, but also for people who are sharing their life with someone who might struggle in that way. Because um, it's not like you can, especially with a disorder like borderline personality disorder, if the person just learns about it in isolation, it doesn't actually cover all the bases. That's an important thing to understand, actually, and maybe for other disorders as well, but particularly for BPD. If the people in your life don't understand what it's all about and how they could be accidentally making it worse, and exactly what you're going through with it, it makes for reduced compassion and really not taking very effective approaches. And tragically, actually, it can actually make the condition worse because people kind of assume that they understand mental health when they don't. So that's one of the things that I like to put forward is like if you think you understand mental health and you haven't gone to school for it or you haven't like sat in a therapist chair for 10 or so years, there's a good chance you don't get it. So,
Well,
um,
you're probably familiar with the line. People who think they know everything really annoy those of us who do. And that applies to almost every aspect of my life. Everybody thinks they know everything.
people are quick to assume, quick to judge. And I mean, and I was thinking about this just last night. I think it applies to all fields. Like people are very quick to judge, like, for example, a politician, even though they've never done the job, right? They've never sat in that
Mhm.
chair. They've never done the work for however many years. They didn't learn about all the nuances and variables and all the complexities of it. And yet they kind of sit there and talk like they know what they're talking about.
Right. Right.
Like in Alberta, it's really funny. Like people like to scapegoat Justin Trudeau in Ontario, right? Or
Mhm.
wherever he lives, um, in Ottawa. But so he becomes an object of hate and sort of a scapegoat for all the problems that a person might experience when they've never been a politician. They don't really understand the complexities of politics. And then kind of say, well, I'm just going to blame all my pain on him. So anyway, it's the same thing with other fields, right? Like I can't possibly think that I could understand what Guy has learned all of the years, all of his education, teaching, all of his education, sharing, like all the written works that he's done and all the connecting of. I can't possibly assume that I can just say I know what he does. It would be foolish, and so it's kind of funny if people could be talking to you in a way like you don't know what you're talking about. Like, it's just kind of funny how people do this. And I guess I'm kind of going off track here about my course, but I guess the point is don't please don't assume that you know how to work with mental health and how to help people if you have never cracked a book, if you've never attended a course, if you've never consulted with a professional, a therapist. Please don't assume that you know how to do it. I mean, you wouldn't want someone operating on your body, right? Like if they just kind of took that kind of approach, like
Right.
they never cracked a book about it. They never like went to school for all those years. You wouldn't want them opening up your body and
Yeah,
and
you know, if they saw something on YouTube about how to perform an appendectomy, that's good enough for me, right?
So I apologize for the rant, but anyway, the course is at freebpdcourse.com, and I encourage you to check it out. And I was saying before a little bit, it's continuing to evolve. I'm running a podcast now too. I'm putting links to the podcast in the course and in the places where it applies. Yes, and you'll find a host of resources and not only my words and my insights and the ways I explain my experiences and what I've learned, but I've included in the course a whole bunch of information from other professionals that supplement and expand upon what I'm saying so that you can kind of get the best of, I guess, as much as is out there from what I was able to find about borderline. So please check it out.
Right, right. And let's see. So today's question from somebody who actually follows our work is, would you please discuss the main dissonances, I assume there we mean cognitive dissonance, between the dominant culture's teachings slash imperatives and ecological slash moral ethics and the stresses those put upon individuals. And obviously the stresses put upon individuals, that's where you come into play because you deal with stressed individuals on a daily basis. And I'm talking about for your professional work, not your personal life. There, we all deal with people who are stressed, including ourselves, many parts of many days. So, so the question for us, the topic for us that was presented by somebody else, and that I thought was a good idea to discuss, is the dissonance, the cognitive dissonance between the dominant culture's approach to basically everything and the stresses that those cognitive dissonances put on us as individuals. Whew.
There's probably so many layers and levels of dissonance. Like I was just kind of imagining how does a human or how have humans approached, for example, generating electricity? So one of the things is to make a dam, right? That's one of the things. So
Right.
that's just one little tiny example of a dissonance between like what we do and then if it's compatible with what nature needs or is symbiotic, if you will. Like what happens if we make a dam? Like a bunch of
Well,
fish, a bunch of things, bad things happen, right?
yes, absolutely. And so the classic example is an anadromous fish like salmon. And those salmon spend part of their lives in freshwater streams or rivers, and then they go to the ocean. And they spend a certain amount of their life in the oceans, and then they go back to the stream where they were hatched, where they have spent their early years, and that's where they produce offspring of their own. And you put a dam in the way, that's a little inconvenient. So we have millions of years, literally millions of years of evolution pointing these fish to go downstream. Oh, and there's a dam in the way. And then if by some miracle they manage to get through the dam on the way down, then they spend their relatively short part of their lives in the ocean. Then they go back, and now they're much bigger animals, and they've been eating all those plankton and so on. And so now there's a dam in the way again. And so humans have tried various approaches to try to mitigate for the loss of habitat that is presented when a dam shows up, including um, ponds that allow the fish to jump up from one pond to the next and go further and further up instead of just being blocked by the dam. And they also capture a bunch in nets and take them up over the dam manually, haul them in trucks, all kinds of crazy things. None of which, I mean, they're probably better than nothing, but none of them come close to the original, the millions
Right.
of years of evolution that these fish have spent creating this one means of getting downstream and back upstream. And now you put a roadblock in the way or a river block in the way. That's problematic, as you can imagine.
So the casualties in nature, yeah, so they become a cost of our doing business, our way of life. They reap the costs associated with that. And
Right. And
so
have you gone to a restaurant recently and ordered salmon? Then you know what the cost is. It's really high because
right.
suddenly salmon, which used to be common, and did you know that in the northeastern United States, people used to be fed lobster in prison because there were so many?
Wow.
There were so many lobsters that they fed them to prisoners because it was dirt food,
Wow. And
right?
now they're dwindling.
And the same with salmon, right? So there's all these organisms that evolved, adapted to a certain set of arrangements for their own lives. And those are no longer there. And when it happens very quickly, like in less than a generation of an organism, that's huge. That's from an ecological perspective, that's just something that that organism can't handle.
So that's an example for nature, eh? And I guess it would be the stress would be on the animals and the related elements of the environment there.
Right,
Um,
right. And it's not
so
just that organism because there's so many other organisms that are interconnected with the life of that organism.
right, yeah. So it's actually a big mess. Just that
Yeah.
one little thing or idea of making a dam is quite kind of catastrophic in a way. And
Yes.
then I was going to kind of just say like this can be there's probably so many more examples of choices that have been made, interventions humans have applied to the earth or to each other. I don't know, like that have these costs that aren't really discussed. I think that the question that in the email was like, can we elaborate? Like, what are more of these things that humans have done um, that create these consequences? And like when I think about mental health, I think it's like a lot of mental health disorder and problems, they wouldn't be happening if we weren't living in this context. Like with all of the different pressures that come with it and all of the different ways that people get their priorities messed up. Because we end up being hyper focused on trying to get that one thing,
Right.
money, and then we end up neglecting other important areas of our life and our health, and then you end up with millions of people who have issues, and then we even forget where it even came from.
Right.
Like this can't. And I was going to say I might be different from some of this other psychologists, and I think I'm similar to Gabor Mate because he's willing to acknowledge the cultural elements that can influence health, right?
Mhm.
Like he's willing to say society needs to be examined, it needs to be spotlighted as part of the problem.
Mhm.
But then on some people on certain parts of the political spectrum, they'll say you can't even question you can't even question society. They'll say it's off the table. This is all individual issues. You society is benign, culture is benign. Uh, that's actually quite alarming if you actually look at that. Like if they say this isn't even allowed to be discussed, really, like
Right.
it's it's
So
not even legitimate.
for anybody who says that, I encourage you to read A People's History of the United States, 1491 to 2000 or 2010, whenever the book came out, Howard Gardner's book. And it's amazing. It's the people's history part is really important because it takes the perspective of the people, starting in 1492 when Christopher Columbus and his inept crowd of sailors showed up and immediately tortured and enslaved indigenous people. And so the stories are written from the aspect of those people,
Hmm,
the
hmm.
people who were tortured and enslaved. And
Oh,
so it
okay.
makes for an amazing read.
What's
Um,
that one called again? I'm just going to write that down.
it's called A People's History of the United States.
Yeah, that
And and he subsequently came out with another book, the child's version of the set of stories, which lopped off a few hundred pages. Still plenty long though.
okay. Well, that's a good thing to become, enlightened about from because you said it comes from the perspective of the indigenous, right?
Right. And then later other indigenous people, for example, the core of Discovery is the group led by Meriwether Lewis and something Clark. I can't remember his name. Lewis and Clark, anyway, led this expedition um, as ordered by Thomas Jefferson. So it was in the early 1800s, and they got to a place called the Weippe Prairie, and that's where they first met the Nez Perce indigenous tribe. And the Nez Perce indigenous tribe fed them salmon because they were starving. They'd come across the Rocky Mountains at this point, and there was nothing to eat. It was a biological desert at that time.
Hmm.
They meet the Nez Perce tribe and they're fed salmon and they think it's amazing. So they just keep eating it and eating it. It's incredibly rich food, as anybody who has eaten salmon knows. And so then they threw up and then they ate a whole bunch more and then they vomited some more, rinse and repeat, because they were just starving to death. And this was
Right.
incredibly rich food. And
Okay.
so had it not been for the Nez Perce tribe, I doubt we'd have many of the problems we have today because Lewis and Clark never would have made it to the Pacific coast. And,
Interesting.
that opened up all kinds of routes and possibilities for accelerating capitalism. Yay.
Yay. Uh, and
Well,
that's
and
that's another thing, you know.
when I was a kid going to school, this was a hero story, right? Because they
Um,
found the way for us so that
right,
now we have all these things like
right,
sing.
right. Yeah, we do get fed a particular narrative, right? And I guess education is kind of it's designed that way, right? To only certain things are allowed to be uh, put forth, explained in a certain kind of way, so that kids grow up thinking this is the world that they're in.
Right, and this is one of the important elements that was sent to us in this question, the dissonances between the dominant culture's teachings slash imperatives. We are taught this story. I was taught that Lewis and Clark were the good guys, and the whole expedition was comprised of heroes.
Mhm.
And I never imagined looking at it from the perspective of the indigenous people or the indigenous organisms, many of which had been driven to extinction in the wake of the expedition by Lewis and Clark.
Wow. So yeah, I mean it's really unfortunate, to say after all this time that that it had to turn out that way. And I guess that some humans really want to take this dissonant approach with life and nature. And it's I
And
mean, is it what other word can you use? Like
well, that's the easy way, right? If we just look away, if we don't read people's history of the United States, if we don't look seriously at all that has gone wrong, largely as a result of a relatively few Caucasian men, well, then That's problematic. Knowing is problematic. Not knowing is problematic. It's all a mess. What are you going to do?
Right. Well, I think I was certainly fed imperatives, or at least I absorbed them, even if they weren't fed to me point blank from the people in my life or my teachers. Um, like I grew up with the 100% belief that I have to figure out how to participate in the money world, right? I have to
Right.
figure out how to make money. I have to, if I can't do it by some sort of extraordinary talent, then I have to do it by extremely hard work and education.
That's the singular metric of success in this society.
Mhm.
Money. How much money do you make? You
Yeah,
know,
and if you don't have it, then you're going to be homeless or dead, basically.
yes.
Basically.
It's interesting when I was on speaking tour on a regular basis for whatever that was, 5 or 10 years, somebody would come up before a presentation, and every single time they would ask, "What do you do?" And by that they meant, "How do you make money?" That's the
Right.
first question. That's the first question in our mind when
Yeah.
we meet somebody is how successful is this person? Is this person
Yes.
wealthy? Because if so, I need to somehow get attached to this person so that I can become wealthy too, right?
That happens. I think people do get qualified. There's this immediate kind of judgment that people are trying to assess, I guess, assess, judge, qualify to see where this person fits. Do I want to be associated with them? Should I run? Kind of thing, right? And so there's very little time actually getting to know a person. It's just like more like, what is your status kind of thing, right? And I guess we have this polite way of asking, what do you do?
Right, right, right.
Maybe we should just say, what is your status? And should I have anything to do with you?
Well, it's interesting because most of that time I was living on a homestead that I created in southwestern New Mexico. And so I had goats. I would milk the goats. That's how I would provide milk for myself and cheese. So people would ask what I do, and I'd say I build fences and I milk goats. Like that hand you shook, for example, just milked a goat yesterday. So you might want to wash your hands because these are really unusual things that people perceive as being somehow weird, right?
Mhm.
But this
Mhm.
is the way everybody in this country lived 70 years ago, 80 years ago. Everybody got up in the morning and they milked the goat. They took care of the animals they had, small or large animals, and they helped grow the food that they were going to eat. This was normal two
Right,
generations ago.
right. So, I mean, things have changed, I think is what you're saying.
Yeah, just a little.
And these imperatives, like I like that word. It sounds like it's quite a fitting word, imperative. It sounds like things are forced
Yes.
on
And to a certain
people.
to a certain extent they are. The way we are taught in the public schools in this country comes to us through federal standards. You have to teach these things, and then through state standards, which tend to put a further vice on the federal standards, tie it down even a little bit more so that
Mhm.
you're not far off when you speak about people in this country, almost all of which went to the public schools. You're not far off in saying that everybody mislearned the same things. Everybody learned the same wrong things when they went to school.
And how many things that are important things are omitted, like
Yeah,
mental
all
health,
of them.
like mental health. Like I always ask, like, why isn't it in the school system? Like, there's got to be a reason, right? Like, and one of the things that I've discovered about when I learned about mental health was that it moved me further and further away from really traditional understandings of how life works and how people get on well. Like it kind of it switched the narrative. So the more I got enlightened with mental health, the more I was like against religion, the more I was like against a lot of right-wing mentality and sentiment, probably a lot against a lot of mainstream things. So I guess it makes sense to me that you'd want to leave mental health out. And also because it would actually make people less reliant on the system because if you become mentally healthy, you have more independence. You don't depend on drugs, for example, as much. And you don't depend on you don't end up getting sick in other ways that are not needed, or like, because the more we don't know how to take care of ourselves, the more we get sick with a whole variety of things. Like, for example, autoimmune diseases are a big one, and
Hmm. Hmm.
Gabor Mate talked about those at length in his book called When the Body Says No. He has a whole bunch of case studies in there of people who like accidentally neglected their mental health because they were in pursuit of their dreams or whatever, or they were otherwise indoctrinated into our society in a way that where they didn't learn how to take care of themselves. So these imperatives,
Hmm.
they they lead us down a path of, I think, disorder and illness in many ways.
Right.
Um,
And
yeah,
and you talked about we've talked before, and I'm sure we talked about this particular example before, the in the United States public education system, there we're taught two things. We're taught two things. Howard Gardner, who I attributed as writing the book People's History of the United States, but that's not right. Howard Gardner wrote a book about I think it was called The Theory of Multiple Intelligences. And in that book and in much of his other work, he has talked about how we have various kinds of intelligence. For example, uh, mathematical, linguistic, and those are the two we're taught in the public school system. But there's a bunch more. There's intrapersonal communication. That means thinking to yourself. That means spending the night looking up at the stars and wondering where I came from. That means thinking about my place in the universe. There's interpersonal communication. That's where, people who are good at interpersonal communication become good at selling things or becoming good politicians, for example, because they interact well with people. There's musical intelligence, there's kinesthetic intelligence. Michael Jordan was particularly good at that, probably still is. The rest of us are no Michael Jordans, right? So he was and is amazing at kinesthetic intelligence, but they don't give grades for that in the public school system. So there are all these different kinds of intelligence, and we focus on exactly two
right.
in the public school system in the United States.
So we could take a different approach, but there's something about this imperative that we keep it narrowly defined,
Right.
as you were saying. Uh, and that creates all kinds of problems that people don't understand that can stem from that. Uh, I guess which is this is a piece of enlightenment. Hopefully, you can get from these videos is something that I've been able to glean and learn over the years. I guess is that if you don't know what you don't know.
Hmm. Hmm.
And how can you know what you don't know when you didn't know you were supposed to know it? Does that make
Right.
sense?
Right.
Like,
Well, when most people come across the idea of multiple intelligences, different ways of understanding the world, a light goes on. Of course, there's different musical intelligence. When I was in high school, I played first chair saxophone because I practiced all the time. The the person sitting next to me played saxophone, and when we're warming up before class starts, he starts playing a popular song. Then, in the
mhm.
1970s, he's playing this popular song. I look at his sheet music, and it's not that. He's doing it from ear. And I stopped him. I said, well, what are you doing? How are you doing that? Oh, he says, I'm just playing it by ear. And in that moment, up until that time, I thought I was going to be a professional musician. At that moment, I realized that I suck
Yeah.
at music. I could do fine as long as I got the sheet music in front of me and I practice all the time. But he's playing it by ear. Like, are
Yeah.
you kidding me? In that moment, I realized I was never going to be a professional musician.
There's a few examples of famous musicians who never learned a note of music. I think two are Jimi Hendrix and Eddie Van Halen. They were both phenomenal, and I don't think they had they didn't have formal training of any kind. They just picked it up, right?
That's why
So
Jimmy
yeah.
that's why Jimi Hendrix played left-handed. He didn't know any better, right?
Yeah, he played a right-handed guitar and he just flipped it. Yeah, that was
Amazing.
pretty cool. Yeah. So these imperatives, I mean, what else can we say about them, I guess, and some other examples about them? I mean, I think there can be how the culture impacts on humans from all the ways that we have to live in this culture. And then, of course, there can be the level of how the animal kingdom and the environment is affected by human decisions. Um, and it's all underlain by this kind of urge to live like kings or to dominate, right?
Hmm.
Uh,
Hmm.
capitalism is just kind of another version of the reign of the kings, isn't it? Like it's just
Yes,
another. It's
yes,
a
absolutely. I had this college roommate. I've told stories about Dusty Tenney from the first time I was on YouTube, and he was hilarious and really challenging to live with. He was one of my college roommates, and he used to go around asking people, "You want to be king for the day?" And everybody wants to be king for the day. That sounds great. And so everybody'd say yes. And he says, "Good, because the king buys lunch today. Where are we going?"
That's funny. But I mean, it's just sort of, I guess instead of having a few kings, now you just have a whole slew of kings, people who
Right.
live like kings, right? And somehow it's good to want to live like a king. And I think that was put upon me as well. Like, it's really good people would say, Peter, it's really good to have ambition, right? Like, and the words ambition and greed, I think that there's a really fine line there. Um, and it's really weird how people can mess with language, if you know what I mean.
You know, some people are amazing at language and they use it for good. George Carlin was incredible. His understanding of the English language, his use of the English language made for hilarious skits. But most people just don't know shit. And so they try to use the language and they get off track all the time. You can do so much by changing a word or two in
Yeah.
every imaginable sentence.
And the people who have dominance, I think that they've got that figured out quite well, or that they've, learned how they can use it for manipulation sometimes. Like it can also be used for good. I gather, right? Like
Right.
it's not like it's always used in a bad way. But yeah, I hope as we're talking here, it's like we're able to assemble some of these pieces about how this has all been kind of happening to us over the years and how it's all probably been like beyond our awareness in a lot of ways. I mean, the thing that really stuck out to me in mental health and all like I've been doing this for about 20 years now with education and work. Like the thing that really stood out to me was that I was living in ignorance. And uh, if I had have known what I know now, like 20 years ago, the sequence of my life would have changed in a dramatic way. So I was kept in the dark because I didn't live in a society that was enlightened. I'm certain
Right.
of that now, right? I wasn't fed the right information at the right time, and my caregivers didn't know they didn't know how to work with emotions and mental health at the right moments either. So they were in the dark, right? It's like we're in the dark.
Right.
Like
I I used to tell my students on the first day of class, "You're ignorant," and they get all like, "What? I am not." They go, "We're all ignorant about different things. You know a lot more about some things than I do, and I know quite a bit
hmm,
more about the topic for this course than you do. So
right,
that's why we're here is to try to overcome that ignorance. Ignorance is it's not a bad thing, unless it's willful, of course. But
right,
it's not like intelligence. Ignorance, you just haven't got there yet."
right, yeah. And so we end up in these dissonances. We are subject to these imperatives, and we don't even realize that we are.
Hmm.
We don't realize the consequences of it all. Like I didn't think a dam was a bad thing. Like,
Right.
because I didn't know anything about it. Like I just thought that's what, that's just what we do and it's no big deal. So when I would look at a dam or even think about it, that concept before learning about it through some of these discussions with you and others, I would be like, that's no big deal. That's
Well,
it.
yeah. Get this: the Dworshak Dam was built on the North Fork of the Clearwater River when I was a kid, and so every year for I don't know 4 or 5 years, whatever, the class would make a trip to Dworshak Dam. It was a field trip. It was about an hour and a half drive away and an hour and a half drive back. We'd go down there and see this monument to humanity's greatness under construction. And of course it did all the horrible things that dams always do. It's the largest dam of its kind in this hemisphere. So it's a big deal. And so obviously it destroyed the salmon run.
Right, right, right.
But we
And
never heard about that part.
and maybe here's another angle here. So the people who would want to build a dam, who would say, it's in our best interest, they might even say it's the only way. It's our only option. So they would rationalize the harms that come from it through some kind of explanation like that.
Well, right. I hear this all the time. It's progress. You can't get in the way of progress. And
Uh,
progress, as near as I can tell, progress always comes at the expense of the natural world.
Progress, yeah.
It always comes at the expense of other organisms.
And this is rationalized as normal, as necessary, right?
We have to. Are you kidding? There's what do we call um, people, political people whose ideas are matched up with ours? They're progressives.
Okay, yes.
That's in this country, the so-called left-leaning people in the Democratic Party, they're called progressives. They aren't called liberals anymore because somehow that word got tainted. So now we call them progressives. Progress comes at a cost, folks.
Which isn't discussed,
Oh,
which isn't highlighted in the process. Like, so if you're going to construct a dam, like does everybody in the whole area know what's involved in that? All the harms, the list of harms that are going to come from. Do people, are they given that? I
of
don't think we're
course
given.
not. Of course not. And even if all the humans are told what's coming, all the non-human animals are not told. I guarantee you that. So when you have a dam, there's a reason for that. It's to back up all this water. And this water floods this place that used to be water free. There'd be a stream running through. So there are all these organisms. There's deer and elk and moose and birds and all kinds of organisms that lived there successfully for many, many, many years, longer than you and I have been on the planet, or even our grandparents. And we're just going to flood them
Right.
for a few dollars more?
That's the rationalization. They would say it's good for a human community. It's good for the economy. It's whatever. It's bad for them. It's good for us, but we don't actually know how bad for them, right?
Right. Because we haven't studied that yet, because there's not ever any money to study that.
Or they just refuse to highlight it, to openly talk about it, right? Because it might create some discord or you know, some problems with the people in charge.
Right.
And again, here we go, where there's a lot of being kept in the dark. Just as I was saying before about mental health, we're kept in the dark, um, whether by design or whether by accident. It just is, we are kept in the dark. So we don't live in a culture of like total openness about all the costs and consequences of what we choose to do.
No, no, no.
Like even if you think about cigarettes, like it took like a long, long time to have the consequences put in portrait on those packages, right? Like, and
Yes.
they fought that tooth and nail and even denied there were any consequences at all
Right.
for many years. And that's isn't that corporate mentality, like to hide the costs and consequences of what they do.
Absolutely. And climate change is the new cigarette.
Mhm.
Sitting all day is the new cigarette. These are the things that we're not told about now that are bad for our health. And the evidence is abundant at this point, just as it was in the 1970s with tobacco. Here's something
Right.
interesting. A little. personal aside. When I was touring Western Europe, I think it was 2015, I was in the middle of the tour. Somebody sent me an email message saying that I'd been asked to speak to PMI. I go, what's PMI? They said Philip Morris International, the biggest tobacco company in the world, and they want to hear you speak. You know, really, that's interesting. So, I'm willing to talk to anybody, right? So I went and had an appointment with the CEO. The CEO of Philip Morris International talked with me for an hour and a half. You have no idea what this person's time is worth. This is a multimillionaire, right? I don't remember his name now. He was influenced by his wife, who'd been following my work for a while. So she put him up to it. And so the whole time we talked to him, 90 minutes, whatever, he had one question. Where's the last place I can grow tobacco?
Oh, because you know how things are ending is the idea, and where's the
Right,
last
right,
place? Okay.
exactly. So he was so focused on making money, on growing tobacco, that that's all he could think about. So you need to tell me where's the last place Philip Morris International is going to make money.
Wow.
It was it was so interesting on so many levels. So I delivered the presentation, right? And this was in Europe at the time. So this is 2015 in Europe at the time. They had banned cigarette smoking everywhere. Even in private businesses like this one, you couldn't smoke, but you could still vape. So I look out, there's like 50 people in the audience, and every one of them is vaping. It's just little puffs of smoke as I'm doing this presentation. I said, thanks you all. And it started by saying, I thank you all for coming. I'm sure you have other important things to do, and I really appreciate you taking the time out. And somebody in the back of the room says, we have to be, oh, somebody says, are you saying we don't have to be here? And the CEO who's sitting in the front row turns around and says, yes, you have to be here. Whoa! I never encountered that kind of culture before.
Wow.
I grew up as a university professor.
Right. Right.
Everything is
Yeah.
optional.
Right. Right. Quite a drastic difference. And so, what did you to give him a place where he could plant tobacco? No,
No,
no.
I said, even if there's tobacco going to be there, there's not going to be humans there, so you don't need to worry about it.
Yeah.
Besides which, what is wrong with you?
You're right.
It was just crazy.
Well, that's an extreme example, I think, of the general mentality in many ways, and even probably part of the mentality that I've even adopted when I was growing up, right? So you have your priorities in a very kind of twisted, what a way that conforms to the way the dominant players want you to think.
Right,
Um, so I would pro if I had have never been exposed to any other like types of learnings like this or talk to people like you or I don't know, if I just didn't have that general curiosity, I probably would have just stayed hyper focused like that. And I know people in my life who are hyper focused like that. They are only focused on increasing their bank account or they're primarily interested. Like
right,
they're still human in ways, I'll grant, but they're primarily interested in what's my next vehicle going to be,
right,
how much can I sell my house for? How much am I going to have for my retirement?
right,
When can I move up the ladder in my field of work? Like that's the thinking.
right.
It's
It's not about the money per se. It's what the privileges the money will bring. That's what matters. It's about the car. It's about the house. It's about all this other stuff. It's about going out to dinner every night.
having as much as possible, I think is the idea, and kind of being a quote unquote winner in that way. Like I'm the winner at the game of life as I was taught it. Um, And I think that's the madness that you were talking about. It's just, and I think John Lennon described it well, like we live in a society of crazy. I can't remember how he put it, but there's a quote from John Lennon about that. Like we're led by crazy people for maniacal ends or something.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
yeah.
That's obvious to some people. And to the majority of people, they can't even begin to understand what that means. What do you mean? What do you mean maniacal people?
Right.
I'm normal. Everybody I know is normal. What do you mean maniacal? Right?
I think if we could hand people a big list of all the consequences of the actions that we've taken over the years, all the environmental consequences, and all the things that are going to prevent sustainability um, from being possible. If we had that information, just a nice long list. This is what dams do. This is what this other human activity does. This is what this human activity does. Like how many things have we done that have made consequences?
Right. All of them.
And like the feedback loops that you describe are probably that's kind of at the other side of the equation of all those consequences.
Right. Right. Yeah,
Right?
those are the kinds of things we don't want to think about.
Hmm.
So they don't come up in casual conversation. We're in the public schools, we're not allowed to have those conversations. We just can't talk about certain things. Trust me.
Yeah.
I know.
Did a thumb appear on my screen? I did something. I thought
I
I
saw
saw like
that too. That was weird. I
I was
thought you
like,
did that. It was just
no.
floating,
I was like,
discombobulated.
I'm just gonna be open about it because now I want to know how I did it. It's like this big thumbs down while I'm talking. That's cool.
Right. And just floated across the screen. I thought
Maybe
you did that.
maybe there's yeah, something in the machine that's after me. Bit of paranoia. Anyway, I guess we've kind of, rounded the subject out a little bit there, hopefully with a bit of humor there. But like,
Right. And can you just talk very briefly about the stresses that are put upon individuals as a result of these cognitive dissonances?
I mean, if you actually think about the amount of devastation that can come to families and individuals from the lack of knowing how to be a healthy human, from the being caught up in the system, uh, being having our priorities in a not good way, like the consequences are untold. The stresses are untold. I would say, like, how many families have been blown to bits because of unmanaged mental health problems?
Hmm. Hmm.
Like probably millions, right? Like the suicide rate for BPD is 10%. So 10% of people who acquire BPD are going to die by suicide, and 40% are going to attempt. That's that's in the literature for BPD, and that's just BPD, right?
Holy cow.
Yeah,
That's amazing.
it's a very serious condition, and that's why I'm highly motivated to help as well.
Hmm.
But like, so the stresses, okay. How much stress is a family under when they are unable to communicate and when they are at each other's throats? What's the stress on a child when a parent is freaking out and can't handle their emotions? If you think about this, and how much of this was came as a package with capitalism because we were hyper focused on how to keep up with the system and how to have enough money just to eat another meal or to pay our rent, right? Like this is I think I'm speaking truth when I say this. How many mothers have had to be apart from their children when they were in the developmental stages because they needed a second income? They
Right.
probably had to get on a bus and go to work probably 3 hours away. I'm pretty sure Bill Clinton made some policy that made it so that they reduced the maternity leave.
Hmm. Hmm.
So mothers couldn't spend as much time with their children and be there for them and nurture them, even if they didn't have enough knowledge to do it in the best ideal way. Anyway, there was just being apart from them physically is a problem too.
And this is
Well,
standard practice now, and it has been for an entire generation.
I guess yeah.
Every household has two people working. Both parents have to work. That's just the way it is. It was never that way when I was a kid. A
And
generation ago,
right.
this never happened.
So parent kids often can't have their mothers sufficient for a sufficient period of time. Like, and one of the things that Gabor Mate explains, he in one of the videos, I looked up two key words in Google. I looked up capitalism and Gabor Mate. He has a few good videos on this. Anyway, he said that the way the Europeans they do it different from tribal communities. Tribal communities the way they raise their children is there's always a parent. There's always a
Mhm.
parent around. Another thing is you always pick up your child when it's crying. Always. You don't let them cry themselves to sleep so that they can like learn to self-soothe. Like that's just harmful, harmful, harmful. So, and the other one was that I think uh, when a baby is always attached to the mother. So like physically together.
Right,
Like the mother would carry them on like a backpack, like kind
right,
of deal. So that's just an example of how like they did it so that they could grow up to be healthier and feel safe in the world. But if you're always abandoning children because parents have to go out to work, and you're further abandoning them because they're living in complete mental health ignorance, the stresses are going to be untold.
right,
Am I making sense? The stresses
right,
are going to be so huge. You're going to end up with disorders like borderline and others where people end up committing suicide because they don't know how to live in their bodies.
right.
Is this making sense?
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, it makes no sense the way we're doing everything, but it makes sense the way you're describing.
And I mean, I'm borrowing a lot of things that I've learned from others. This isn't Peter Miller information. I've learned from other scholars and other
Right,
professionals, and
right.
I've learned some things for myself too. But a lot of this is not, it's secondhand information, I guess.
Yeah,
But
you've made it perfectly clear that your free course depends upon the work of a lot of other people.
yeah, yeah, it's part my experience and a lot of the things that I've learned from the whatever other professionals, colleagues that have enlightened me, and yeah, a lot of the good books that I've read, a lot of the good videos I've watched, and yes, even the things that I learned in university.
Occasionally a piece sneaks through.
I mean, university was helpful. I'll admit that becoming a therapist, you don't become a real therapist until you've worked in the field for a long time. But school has its place, I guess.
Sure. Okay, let's wrap it up right there. I even have an idea for next week, but I can't tell you because it's hidden behind the screen. So I don't even know what it is anymore, but I'll send it to you after this call.
Sounds
Anyway,
good.
so why don't you hit us one more time with your free course and then we'll wrap this up.
Yeah, please check out my free course on borderline personality disorder at freebpdcourse.com. And there's links in there to my podcast. I've also started doing some writing in follow-up to the podcast episodes if you want to learn even more about the things that I speak about in the podcasts. So, um, yeah, everything you ever wanted to know about Peter Miller and what he's learned about borderline and what others could contribute to that is at freebpdcourse.com.
Thank you. I appreciate it very much, and I look forward to our conversation in a week.